Beloved, there is a place in God where understanding does not come first, obedience does. Many people have been taught, consciously or unconsciously, to wait until everything makes sense before they move. They want clarity, confirmation, evidence, and reassurance before they take a step of faith. But faith was never designed to function that way. Faith does not operate on full information. Faith operates on trust in God. If God required understanding before obedience, faith would be unnecessary, and walking by sight would replace walking by faith. There are times when God speaks to the spirit of a person with unmistakable clarity, yet the mind immediately rises up with questions. The natural reasoning says, why this, or why now, or what if this fails? But God does not speak first to the intellect. He speaks to the heart. The Spirit knows before the mind agrees. That is why obedience is a spiritual act, not a mental one. Obedience is saying yes to God even when the mind has not caught up with what the Spirit has already heard. Throughout the Word, God consistently asked people to move before they understood. He told people to go where they had never been, to speak words that seemed unreasonable, and to act in ways that appeared unnecessary. The common thread in every divine instruction was not logic but trust. God was never testing their intelligence. He was testing their reliance on Him. When a person insists on understanding everything before acting, they are unknowingly placing their confidence in their own reasoning rather than in God's wisdom. Obedience without understanding requires humility. It requires acknowledging that God sees what we cannot see and knows what we do not know. Human understanding is limited to time and circumstance, but God's instructions are rooted in eternity. What seems unnecessary now may be essential later. What feels uncomfortable now may be protecting you from something unseen. God often withholds explanations, not to confuse His people, but to teach them dependence. When a believer obeys God without understanding, something powerful happens in the unseen realm. Heaven recognizes that act of faith as complete trust. Angels respond not to human logic, but to divine authority. The moment obedience is activated, spiritual mechanisms begin to move that the natural eye cannot perceive. Protection is set in place. Direction is adjusted. Opposition is restrained. None of this requires the believer to understand it. It only requires obedience. Many delays in the lives of believers are not caused by a lack of prayer, but by hesitation in obedience. God has already spoken, but the person is still analyzing. They are still weighing options. They are still asking for signs. Yet faith does not need a sign once God has spoken. Faith responds. Obedience is faith in action. It is saying, God, your word is enough for me. Even when emotions are unsettled and circumstances are unclear, the most dangerous thing a believer can do is replace obedience with reasoning. Reasoning has its place, but it is never a substitute for following God. When God gives an instruction, He has already accounted for every consequence, every resistance, and every outcome. The responsibility of the believer is not to figure it out, but to carry it out. There is a spiritual realm that responds to obedience in ways the natural mind cannot measure. Many believers are unaware that when God gives an instruction, heaven does not wait for emotions to settle or circumstances to align. Heaven responds the moment obedience is released. Angels are not moved by human sympathy, fear, or hesitation. They move by divine command. When a believer obeys God, they are aligning themselves with the authority of God's word, and that alignment activates spiritual assistance. Angels are assigned to serve those who belong to God, but they are not idle spectators. They are active agents who respond to faith expressed through obedience. Obedience is not merely compliance, it is cooperation with heaven. When a person chooses to obey God, they are giving heaven legal access to intervene in earthly affairs. What looks like a simple step in the natural can trigger powerful movement in the unseen realm. The angel with a sword is a picture of divine authority and protection. A sword represents judgment against opposition, resistance against the enemy, and enforcement of God's will. When obedience is exercised, God ensures that what stands against his purpose does not prevail. The believer may not see the angel, may not feel anything unusual, and may not immediately recognize what has shifted, but heaven has already taken its position. Many people assume that angels appear first and obedience follows, but the pattern is often the opposite. Obedience comes first, and then divine assistance is revealed. God does not always show what he is doing behind the scenes because faith is not sustained by sight. If everything were visible, faith would be unnecessary. God allows obedience to precede manifestation so that trust is strengthened and dependence on him deepened. There are moments when obedience feels risky, vulnerable, and even dangerous. In those moments, God does not remove the sense of risk. He removes the actual danger through unseen protection. The believer walks forward, unaware that resistance has been restrained, traps have been disabled, and opposition has been silenced. The angel with a sword stands as evidence that God takes obedience seriously and guards those who follow his voice. When a believer delays obedience, they delay the activation of what God has already assigned to them. Angels are sent forth, but they respond to God's word in motion. Obedience puts God's word into motion. It gives direction to spiritual forces that are already prepared to act. Hesitation does not cancel God's plan, but it can postpone the benefits that obedience would immediately release. Obedience does not mean the absence of fear, it means the presence of trust. God never promised that obedience would feel comfortable, but he did promise that it would be covered. When a believer steps out in obedience, they are not stepping out alone. Heaven steps with them. Authority surrounds them. Protection precedes them. God does not send his people where his power has not already gone. The angel with the sword also represents God's commitment to fulfill his word. Once obedience is given, God takes responsibility for the outcome. The believer is no longer carrying the burden of results. God is. Obedience transfers responsibility from human effort to divine oversight. That is why God values obedience so highly, because it places trust where it belongs and allows him to work without interference. Many believers struggle, not because God has not spoken, but because obedience feels costly. When God gives an instruction that challenges comfort, reputation, or security, the first response of the flesh is resistance. The natural mind calculates loss before it considers purpose. Yet God never measures obedience by convenience, measures it by trust. Obedience often requires letting go of control, and that is one of the hardest sacrifices a believer can make. God's instructions are sometimes simple in wording, but demanding in execution. The difficulty is not in understanding what God said, it is in agreeing to do it without negotiating the terms. People often attempt partial obedience, hoping that compromise will still produce full results, but obedience cannot be divided. It is either complete or it is delayed. God honors obedience because it demonstrates surrender, and surrender is the language of faith. The unseen realm recognizes obedience as a legal transaction. When a believer obeys God, they are submitting themselves under divine authority, and that authority provides coverage. Disobedience removes that covering, not because God withdraws his love, but because the believer steps outside the order God established. Obedience keeps a person positioned where God can protect, guide, and sustain them according to his will. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom. A person may say they are being cautious, but in reality, they are avoiding obedience. Fear always demands guarantees before acting, but faith responds to God's word without conditions. Obedience is not reckless, it is disciplined trust. It is choosing to rely on God's character rather than on predictable outcomes. When God instructs, He already knows the resistance that will arise, and He has already provided what is necessary to overcome it. Obedience also exposes the motives of the heart. When God speaks, the response reveals whether a person values God's voice above personal preference. Some want God's blessings but not His direction. Others want His promises but not His process. Obedience accepts both. It accepts that God's ways may disrupt personal plans, but it also trusts that His ways are always higher and more complete. There are moments when obedience feels lonely. Others may not understand the decision, may question it, or even oppose it. God does not always surround obedience with public affirmation. Sometimes He removes human support so that dependence on Him becomes complete. In those moments, obedience becomes an act of worship. It declares that God's approval is more valuable than human agreement. Delayed obedience is often disguised as waiting on God, but God is often waiting on the believer. He has already given instruction, and heaven is prepared to respond. The delay is not on God's side. Every step of obedience carries momentum. The sooner obedience is released, the sooner divine alignment occurs. Obedience is not about proving loyalty. It is about positioning oneself to receive what God has already prepared. When a believer obeys God despite fear, confusion, or opposition, they are demonstrating spiritual maturity. They are acknowledging that God's word is sufficient even when emotions are unsettled. Obedience stabilizes the believer internally before it ever changes circumstances externally. It anchors the heart in trust and keeps the believer moving forward even when the path is unclear. Understanding is often treated as a requirement for obedience, but in the life of faith, it is usually a result, not a prerequisite. God does not withhold explanations because He lacks clarity. He withholds them because faith grows in the absence of full information. If everything were explained in advance, trust would be unnecessary. God calls believers to rely on His word even when the future remains undefined and the reasoning incomplete. Human understanding is limited by experience, education, and perspective. God's instructions, however, are formed from a complete view of past, present, and future. What appears confusing in the moment is often precise when seen through God's eternal perspective. Obedience aligns a believer with that perspective even when they cannot yet see it. By obeying, they step into God's order rather than attempting to shape outcomes through their own insight. God often speaks in ways that bypass natural reasoning. He communicates to the Spirit, knowing that the Spirit can receive truth without analysis. The mind may resist because it cannot trace the outcome, but the Spirit recognizes the authority behind the instruction. Obedience, then, becomes an act of trusting God's wisdom over personal understanding. It is choosing divine insight over human interpretation. When a believer insists on understanding before obeying, they place a limit on how God can lead them. God will not force obedience, and He will not compete with human reasoning. He allows the believer to choose whether they will follow instruction or follow logic. Obedience keeps the believer flexible, teachable, and responsive to God's leading. Understanding without obedience produces knowledge, but obedience without understanding produces transformation. There are seasons when God intentionally leads people into situations that challenge their comprehension. These moments are designed to stretch faith and deepen reliance on Him. In such times, obedience becomes the anchor that keeps a believer steady. It prevents overthinking, fear-driven decisions, and unnecessary delays. Obedience simplifies the path by reducing it to one responsibility: do what God has said. God's instructions are often progressive. He reveals the next step only after the current one is taken. Understanding unfolds in stages, but obedience must occur immediately. Each step of obedience creates clarity for the next instruction. When a believer refuses to move until everything is clear, progress stalls. But when they obey step by step, direction becomes clearer with movement. Obedience also protects the believer from deception. When the mind is overloaded with unanswered questions, it becomes vulnerable to doubt and distraction. Obedience keeps focus on God's voice rather than on competing thoughts. It establishes a pattern of trust that strengthens spiritual discernment. Over time, obedience trains the believer to recognize God's leading more quickly and respond more confidently. The demand for understanding often stems from a desire to control outcomes. Obedience requires surrendering that control. It acknowledges that God is responsible for results, timing, and consequences. This surrender does not weaken the believer. It frees them from the pressure of managing what only God can handle. Obedience allows God to work without interference and positions the believer to receive insight at the proper time. As obedience becomes a consistent practice, understanding begins to follow naturally. Clarity comes not through analysis, but through experience. The believer looks back and sees how each instruction fit into a larger purpose. What once seemed unclear becomes evident, and what once required effort becomes a settled confidence in God's faithfulness. There is a point in every believer's walk where faith must stand alone without visible support. At that point, obedience becomes the evidence of faith. Words can declare belief, but obedience demonstrates it. God is not moved by intentions or good thoughts. He responds to faith that acts. When a believer chooses to obey God, they are making a declaration in the spirit realm that God's word is final, regardless of circumstances. Obedience is the bridge between God's promises and their manifestation. Many promises remain unrealized, not because God is unfaithful, but because obedience has not yet connected the promise to action. God's word carries power, but that power is released through obedience. Faith receives the promise, but obedience gives it expression in the natural world. Without obedience, faith remains passive, waiting rather than moving. There is often a gap between instruction and visible result. That gap is where trust is tested. In that space, nothing appears to be changing, yet everything is being arranged. Obedience sustains faith during that interval. It keeps the believer steady when emotions fluctuate and circumstances seem unchanged. God works in that unseen space, aligning people, timing, and resources according to His will. The enemy often attacks during the obedience gap. Doubt, distraction, and discouragement attempt to pull the believer back into inactivity. The temptation is to reverse the decision or to modify obedience based on feelings. But obedience must remain firm. God honors consistency. When obedience is maintained, resistance loses its influence and the believer remains positioned for God's intervention. Obedience requires patience. God's timing is not designed to test endurance, but to ensure completeness. What God prepares through obedience is often larger than what the believer initially sees. If results came instantly every time, faith would become dependent on speed rather than trust. Obedience trains the believer to rely on God's faithfulness rather than on immediate outcomes. In the obedience process, God often refines character. Trust deepens, humility increases, and dependence on God becomes more natural. These internal changes are as important as the external results. God is not only interested in what obedience produces, He is interested in what obedience develops within the believer. The process shapes the heart to carry the outcome responsibly. Obedience also establishes spiritual authority. When a believer consistently responds to God's voice, they walk with greater confidence and clarity. They become less influenced by fear and more anchored in God's direction. Obedience builds spiritual momentum. Each act of obeyed strengthens the ability to obey again, creating a lifestyle of responsiveness to God. Many believers want the benefits of faith without the discipline of obedience. But faith that does not obey remains incomplete. Obedience activates what faith believes. It turns spiritual truth into lived experience. God entrusts more responsibility to those who obey because obedience demonstrates reliability. It shows that the believer values God's instruction above personal preference. When obedience becomes a settled choice rather than a struggle, peace follows. Not because everything is resolved, but because trust is established. The believer rests knowing that God is at work beyond what can be seen. Obedience keeps the believer aligned with God's purpose, allowing divine order to unfold step by step according to His plan. There are moments when obedience places a believer at a crossroads between what is familiar and what God has spoken. The familiar feels safe because it is known, but God's instruction often points toward what is unseen and untested. In those moments, faith is revealed not by confession alone, but by movement. Obedience is the act of stepping away from what feels secure in order to align with what God has declared. It is not a denial of reality. It is a recognition that God's word holds greater authority than present conditions. God's voice does not always come with urgency, but it always carries weight. When He speaks, He expects a response, not prolonged debate. Delayed obedience weakens sensitivity to God's leading. The longer a believer hesitates, the louder fear becomes and the quieter conviction feels. Obedience preserves spiritual sensitivity. It keeps the heart responsive and the spirit alert to God's direction. Each time a believer obeys promptly, they strengthen their ability to recognize and trust God's voice again. Obedience often requires separation from distractions. God may instruct a believer to leave certain environments, relationships, or habits that interfere with spiritual growth. This separation is not punishment, it is preparation. God removes what limits faith so that His purpose can be fulfilled without interference. Obedience in these areas can feel costly, but what is gained through alignment with God far outweighs what is left behind. When obedience is chosen, God assumes responsibility for provision. Many believers fear obedience because they focus on what they might lose rather than on what God has promised to supply. God never instructs without provision already accounted for. Obedience places the believer under divine care, where resources, strength, and direction are released according to God's timing. The burden of self-reliance is lifted when obedience is embraced. Obedience also establishes order in the believer's life. Confusion often arises when instructions are ignored or postponed. Clarity returns when obedience is restored. God's peace flows where His order is honored. Obedience aligns thoughts, emotions, and actions under God's authority. It removes internal conflict because the believer is no longer torn between God's will and personal preference. There are times when obedience requires standing still rather than moving forward. God's instruction is not always to act visibly. Sometimes it is to wait, remain silent, or hold position. Waiting in obedience is just as powerful as moving in obedience. It demonstrates trust in God's timing rather than pressure for immediate results. Obedience in waiting guards the believer from premature decisions that could disrupt God's plan. As obedience becomes consistent, confidence grows. Not confidence in self, but confidence in God's faithfulness. The believer learns through experience that God honors His word. Past obedience becomes a reference point for future trust. Each act of obedience builds spiritual memory, reminding the believer that God has never failed to support what He has instructed. Obedience is not about earning God's favor, it is about responding to it. God's love is already established, but obedience allows that love to be expressed through guidance and protection. When a believer obeys, they are not striving to be accepted, they are walking in relationship. Obedience keeps that relationship active and responsive. The life of faith is sustained by daily obedience, not by occasional sacrifice. Small acts of obedience carry significant spiritual weight. God values consistency over intensity. When obedience becomes habitual, The believer remains aligned with God's will regardless of circumstances. Faith remains steady because it is anchored in obedience rather than emotion.